Hello, everyone. Welcome to Storybook Insider Preview. Um, Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and I'm stoked to give you a sneak peek of what's in Storybook 6.5. Uh, we're here today because Storybook helps us build component-driven UIs faster. Over the next hour, you'll join us as we preview Storybook 6.5. You'll get to see the new features and how they can make your job easier. You'll also get a chance to ask maintainers questions, the folks here today, and also chat with your fellow developers in the YouTube chat. So please don't hesitate to join us. My name is Dominic, and I'm the co-founder of Chromatic, the company behind Storybook. Joining me are Varun on the developer experience team and Jan in open source engineering. Varun and Jan, say hi to everyone. Before we begin, though, it might make sense to kind of zoom out and take a look at all the teams that use Storybook now. Storybook is the industry standard front-end tool. It helps thousands of teams like you and me create UI components and pages in isolation. Multinationals use it like Netflix and Microsoft and Google and Walmart. Institutions use it like NASA and the European Union, the United Nations World Food Program. Media companies like BBC, The Guardian, Washington Post, and thousands more household brands like Dior, Peloton, and Audi. And if you take a look and throw a rock in any direction, you'll probably encounter a company or a team that uses or has used or is going to use Storybook. And the cool thing about Storybook is you both have a development environment and an artifact that you can publish online for everyone to reference and learn from. And all the companies that I mentioned previously, they have some sense of publishing Storybook so that the rest of the front-end community like us can take a look at what they're doing. That's why we're exploring an ambitious project to index the world's UI components for you to reference and reuse in your projects. I kind of think about this as like the view source, but for the component age. If you were around in the 90s or early 2000s, you probably like right-clicked and view sourced on components or on websites to kind of see how they're built, right? Like uh, uh, when I was first getting started, that was like the table layouts and like what intricate table layouts people were creating to for their fan sites for like Diablo or like any like video games. But we're doing that now for modern websites for the component age. So our community it has scoured the web for open source UI components from the likes of GitHub and the European Union and VS Code. And we've parsed their storybooks to index so far, I believe 3,490 components across 44 projects. And that's even a small subset of what we have in store and what's available online. So the component storybook, the component encyclopedia is now in beta. And I encourage you to take a look at it. It's at storybook.js.org/showcase. And we'll continue to develop it over the next couple of weeks. Now let's move on to Storybook to 6.5. So the major updates in 6.5 are across 4 dimensions. The first dimension is interaction testing, which allows you to simulate user behavior. The next is thinking about performance from a speed and bundle size point of view. And so we've worked with the Webpack and Shopify teams to optimize the Webpack 5 builder to yield a much like faster kind of like load and dev like development experience for you. In parallel, we're also working on like building a pluggable builder API that supports Vite, one of the most promising tools in the front-end ecosystem lately that allows you to work with ESM modules in the browser. And finally, we're exploring the developer to design workflow with the Figma plugin. It's the official plugin from Storybook that allows you to connect stories to variants so that developers and designers can cross-reference each other's work in the same place. And to take us a little bit deeper into the features today, I'm going to pass the mic on to Varun, my esteemed colleague, who's going to walk you through exactly how to use these things and where you can fit them into your workflow. Varun, please take it away.
Thanks, Tom. So let's start by talking a little bit about testing. When it comes to testing UIs, there's a lot you have to account for. You have to make sure that a component is rendering correctly, it's handling user interactions and sort of responding to it and updating state and doing all of those nice things, that the UI is accessible, and data and events are sort of flowing through all of the components on a page as you expect them to. Uh, Regardless of sort of how you go about writing a test, generally the shape of the test tends to be quite similar. You start by setting up some kind of action, setting up some kind of scenario, then you execute an action, and then lastly you verify whether the output is what you expect it to be or not. So when it comes to testing components, you start by providing some mock data to set up a component state. Then you execute an action. In this case, it's either rendering the component in isolation or checking out to see, or sort of running some sort of interactions on top of the component. And then lastly, you verify what the output is as in terms of the DOM structure. So if you pay close attention, what you'll notice is those first two things, that's exactly what a story is. You're already doing all that work in isolating a component and setting up some kind of component state. So why not actually use stories as a test case for everything that a component does, and then pair it with other tools to run all kinds of tests on your component? Now, Storybook already helps you to run visual tests with tools like Chromatic. You can run accessibility tests by pairing it with Axe, or even sort of run interaction tests by running by importing stories into a test file using Jest and testing library. So uh, today, I want to focus on one particular type of testing, that is interaction testing. So where the user can actually click on a piece of UI and execute some action, and you want to make sure that the underlying logic is what you expect it to be and the component is behaving the way you expect it to. So when it comes to interaction testing, most teams tend to use testing library. It is kind of the go-to tool right now for running scripting interactions on UI and also sort of verifying what the output is. And last year, we made it easier to import stories into a test file to write such interaction tests. Now, components rely on context, data, application state, and a whole bunch of other things. When you're writing a story in Storybook, you're already isolating a component and mocking all of those requirements that the component relies on. So why not just reuse all that work that you've done in Storybook and just reuse those stories in a test file? And that way you can just simply render the story and run interactions against it. To enable that, we built a couple of libraries called Testing React, and similarly, there are Testing Vue and Testing Angular, which exposes this compose stories function, which allows you to import not just the story, but all of that other configuration work that you've done in Storybook alongside with it. So, but when you run these tests, they still run in Node using JS and as amazing as JS is and as fast it still is a simulated DOM environment. So if a test fails, all you get is this blob of HTML to debug, which is kind of painful. And if you happen to use any kind of SVGs in your code, it just becomes really, really impossible to sort of parse through all of that output to figure out why the UI isn't behaving the way you expect it to. So to improve that that workflow, we decided, why not actually bring those interaction tests into Storybook itself? You still get to use testing library to write your test, but now the tests are written in the story file instead of importing stories into a test file. and then Storybook runs those tests for you in an actual browser. So how does that work? Let's look at an example. Let's say you want to test a dialog where you click on a button, it opens up a dialog for the user, and then there might be some kind of secondary interaction within that dialog itself. The way that works is now you can write a test in something called a play function, which is a snippet of code that can be attached to the story itself. And this snippet of code is executed after the story renders. So within this play function, you can write the same test you would previously write in a jest test, but now it's living inside the story file itself. And the only thing to note here is one more thing I should point out here, that this play function then receives the canvas element, which is the container for the story that you're trying to write the tests against. So you can then scope your queries to just that canvas element and actually write tests that are focused on that one particular story. The only important thing to note here is instead of using sort of testing library React or some other sort of front-end framework version of testing library, we're using a version of it that has been instrumented for Storybook. So under the hood, this is using testing library DOM. So it's framework agnostic and works with any kind of framework that renders HTML. So you get to use the same developer-friendly syntax that you're already familiar with. And similarly, for the assertions, you get to use a Storybook instrumented version of Jest, which allows Jest to run both in the browser and in Node kind of simultaneously. So when this story loads up in the browser, what you'll see is it starts by rendering the default state of the story, which is you see a button, and then it fires the interactions to actually open up the dialogue and any other sort of interactions and assertions that you have created that you've written in the play function. And the cool thing about having these Storybook instrumented versions of testing library and Jest is we actually give you an interactions panel that visualizes everything that's happening within the play function. And this makes it really easy to debug tests when they're failing. You can step through each aspect that's defined within the play function, or jump to a step where something is failing. And because the test is running in the browser itself, you can just pop open the DevTools and debug to see what's actually happening and why the UI isn't behaving the way you expect it to. So by default, these tests run when you are running Storybook and you're visiting a particular story. But when it comes to running tests, you probably want to run them all simultaneously anytime you make a change in code and make sure that all of your tests are passing. To enable that, we are also shipping something called the Storybook Test Runner. So alongside your Storybook, you can start up npm run test Storybook, and that will start up the Storybook Test Runner. And what the test runner does is it converts all of your stories into a test. So those that don't have a play function attached to it, it simply verifies whether the story is rendering without any errors. And for the ones that do have a play function, it also checks to see whether all of the interactions and all of the assertions within the play function are passing as you expect it to. So under the hood, this test runner is powered by Playwright and Jest. So you get sort of all of the conveniences of watch mode and running specific files or filtering for a specific type of test and all those nice things. Plus, because again, it's powered by Playwright, you can run cross-browser testing. So you can run all of your tests in parallel against multiple browsers, either locally or on the CI. So you can use test runner locally during development, and then again, run it on CI to run all of your tests as a part of the continuous integration workflow. The other really cool thing about the test runner is, even though it's running in the background for you, if any of the tests fail, instead of again just spitting out that output as a blob of HTML in your terminal, what you get is a link to the story where the test is failing. So you can actually click on that link and it will pop open the browser to exactly the story where the test is failing. And you can go in and focus on the step that's failing and start debugging to see why that test isn't working the way you expect it to. And then lastly, if you happen to use Chromatic to run visual tests using Storybook, the interaction testing features sort of work really nicely there. You don't have to do any setup; it kind of works out of the box. Chromatic just waits for the interaction to complete before it captures a snapshot. So this way, you can combine both visual testing and interaction testing in one go. If there are any errors that are encountered while running that interaction test, those surface up as a component error within the Chromatic UI. Plus, along with sort of the core interaction testing feature that's built into Storybook now and the test runner is also customizable. So we provide a hooks API, which allows you to extend the test runner to do perform other tasks. So, for example, if you want to run accessibility checks on all of your stories, you can actually inject Axe Playwright into the page, and then once the story renders, you can run the Axe assertions. And again, if any errors or warnings are found, they will be reported to you as a part of the test runner run. So to get started with this, we have a full tutorial for you. It covers everything from writing tests to automating their execution on CI. You can check out this tutorial to get started, tinycc/sb-test. Moving on to perf, Storybook is powered by builders such as Webpack, which process and bundle up your code so that it can actually run in the browser. And for the past few releases, we've been tweaking Storybook, and in particular, these builders to improve its performance. So going all the way back to Storybook 6.1, that kind of laid down a lot of the foundation for all of the performance work that came in the future. So we started off by dropping Webpack DLLs and pre-built and cached the manager UI for Storybook, allowing Storybook to start up much faster. This was followed by quite a significant re-architecture in 6.2. So up until that point, Storybook was entirely tied to Webpack. So that was the only build tool you could use when working with Storybook. But with 6.2, we abstract that away into a builder API in order to support multiple bundlers at the same time. This allowed us to support Webpack 4 and Webpack 5 simultaneously, and Webpack 5 brought in a few perf improvements which allowed builds to go through a bit faster. With 6.3, what we saw was Webpack 5 became stable and more teams started relying on that. And the Builder API also enabled the Storybook community to add support for modern build tools like Vite and Snowpack. Now, while some teams could take advantage of these modern build tools, most of the JavaScript community still relies on Webpack. For example, Create React App still is powered by Webpack, and a lot of other tools at this point were still powered by Webpack, which required a bit more optimization to improve Storybook's performance. But now that Webpack 5 was stable, we could take advantage of some of its newer features. So in 6.4, we worked with the Webpack and Shopify UX engineering teams to improve load times for published storybooks. Now, these are storybooks that you generate by running npm run build storybook, the static asset, and then uploading it as a website. So in 6.4, we introduced something called on-demand architecture, where Storybook under the hood started using code splitting to only load the code that's required for the first render. So whenever you visit a Storybook URL, whatever's the story that you're visiting, it will only load up the code for that particular story. And what we found was that this cut bundle sizes by up to 3x, and in turn that resulted in up to 4 times faster load times for those published storybooks. With 6.5, we've shifted focus back to improving the local development experience with Storybook. So that's when you start up Storybook, or anytime you hit save, Storybook rebuilds. On the Webpack side, to improve Storybook performance, we added support for lazy compilation and file system caching. And what we saw was, because of those features, Storybook generally started up 3 times faster than it did previously, and rebuilds were up to 2 times faster than before. So let's talk a little bit more about those features in detail, starting with lazy compilation. So when you're working on your application, your app might have multiple routes, in some cases hundreds of routes, but in a development session, you're only focused on a few handful of routes. So why take the cost of compiling all of those pages up front when really you just want to work on a couple of pages at a time? And that's exactly what tools like Next.js do. They're able to start up instantly almost by only building the one page that you're starting off with. And then as you navigate through your application, they progressively build those other pages before the navigation event completes. And we're bringing that exact same experience into Storybook. The only key difference here is instead of using routes as the point of compilation, we're going to use story files as the point of compilation. So Storybook will get going really quickly, and then it will progressively build stories as you visit them in your Storybook. And what that means is for small and mid-sized projects, you'll see marginal improvements in startup times. But for larger projects, it drastically reduces the time it takes for Storybook to start up. And here I have sort of two projects comparing side by side. The Chromatic Codebase, which has over 2,000 stories. So you can see the startup time went from 21.7 seconds down to 6 seconds. Whereas Meal Drop, which is around 92 stories, which is kind of like a mid-sized storybook, again, the start time improved, but it wasn't as dramatic an impact. The other feature we're taking advantage of now is Webpack's file system caching feature. This is where Webpack caches the build output between Storybook runs, and then it uses that information to skip unnecessary rebuilds and just gets going really quickly. So what that means is when you run npm run Storybook for the first time, it has to run the full build. But the next time and all other subsequent builds, it's going to start up much faster because it has that warm cache. It can reuse the assets from the previous builds and see if certain files didn't change. I don't need to rebuild them. So that build process is much faster. And again, you can see that build time went from 21.7. That startup time, sorry, went down from 21.7 seconds down to 2.1 second for a warm cache. And then lastly, the sort of other bit that happens during local development is when you modify a component or a story, you have to wait for Storybook to rebuild those files and refresh the browser. With both lazy compilation and file system caching enabled, in general, Webpack just has to do a lot less work. So what we're finding is with those features enabled, rebuilds have become faster too. So again, this is something that is more impactful the larger your Storybook is. To take advantage of both of these features, you need to be using the Webpack 5 builder. You need to install the Storybook Builder Webpack 5 and Manager Webpack 5 packages, and then configure your Storybook to use the Webpack 5 builder. And then lastly, enable the file system caching and lazy compilation features via the feature flags. So that's on the Webpack side. Shifting focus a bit to Vite, which is more of a next-gen build tool with the aim to provide a much faster and leaner development experience. Now, Storybook has supported Vite for over a year now. It started off as a community project, but was recently moved under the Storybook org. So now it's being published as an official @Storybook package. And during that time, I just want to give a huge thanks to Ian Van Schuten, Josh Wooding, and Eric Stutterberg for making tons of improvements to the Vite builder, which has sort of improved support, and it's generally a lot more stable at this point. And this is just a start. By moving the builder into the Storybook org, we're now committed to first-class support for Vite. So expect a lot more improvements and exciting announcements in the coming months. But at this stage, what we wanted to do was just kind of get a sense of how the two builders compare to each other, and start figuring out what kind of optimizations we can make in Storybook to even further improve the performance for the Vite builder. So I want to give a quick shout out to Ian, who did this deep dive comparing Vite and Webpack builders to see how they perform in Storybook. And it led to some sort of really interesting discoveries, at least for me, that I want to share with you all today. So generally, Vite is supposed to be lightning quick, but when we ran those sort of initial tests, what we found was the startup performance for Vite was surprisingly slower than what we expected. And what's happening here is instead of bundling your entire code base and all of your modules into one or more bundles, what Vite does is it serves all of those individually, so that the browser, so to individually during development process, but for the sort of final production build, it packages all up into a bundle, much like Webpack. But because it's serving those individual ES modules during development, what that means is the server starts up really quickly, but then the browser has to download and process all of those requests, which is why we see that it's quite slow in getting to that first story to render in the browser. So one way to optimize Vite and to get the best out of it when using it with Storybook is to enable Storybook's code splitting feature. So that is the Storybook's Story Store v7 feature flag to enable code splitting. And once you enable that, what happens is now it drastically cuts down the number of modules that the browser has to load up on that first load. And we find that it speeds things up quite dramatically, and Vite starts up in some cases even faster than Webpack, although it's still a little bit slower than when Webpack has lazy compilation and code splitting enabled. The core reason why developers really love Vite is because it offers near instant rebuild times. So you go tweak a file in your code, and as soon as you hit save, it almost instantly rebuilds and the changes show up in your browser. And not surprisingly, this is where we see Vite really shines when it comes to working with Storybook. It is way faster when it comes to rebuild performance compared to Webpack, even with those new features enabled. So if you're curious about sort of more detailed breakdown for how the two builders compare, I would encourage you to check out Ian's post, tinycc/sb-perf, to get more detailed information on how the two builders compare. For the time being, what we're finding is Vite and Webpack offer comparable build times and startup times. However, Vite has way faster rebuild times. And like I said, this is just a start, and we're looking to continue improving support for Vite within Storybook, and look out for more updates in coming months. And lastly, I want to shift focus to talk a little bit about Storybook's new Figma integration. With the component construct, both designers and developers now have sort of a shared mental model for how to think about UIs. Both of them sort of design and build UIs when using components. In design tools, generally designers assemble these sticker sheets where you see a grid of components, each sort of visualizing one state for that particular component. This actually maps really nicely to stories. Like, these sticker sheets are essentially what Storybook gives you, but for coded components. So uh, you've been able to take advantage of this for a long time. The designs add-on within Storybook allows you to embed Figma files right inside Storybook. That way, developers have easy access to the spec while they're building the UI, and they can stay in sync with designers a little bit easier compared to back in the day when you had to jump between multiple tools to figure out, do I have the latest designs? Am I building the right component, and so on. Now, we wanted to close that loop and cycle back to keeping designers aware of sort of what's happening in production. And to do that, we've created this new integration called Storybook Connect. Storybook Connect is a Figma plugin that allows designers to link components to a story and actually embed live stories within Figma itself. So one of the classic hurdles in front-end development is keeping design in sync with what's live in production. By the time the UI is coded, there's always going to be some kind of difference between the design spec that you received and the final UI that you shipped. So to bridge that gap, Storybook Connect allows you to embed stories within Figma itself. And the way that works is you can select a layer within Figma, a particular component, and then link a story to it. And that way, with just one click, you can open up a live story right within Figma itself. And because these are live stories, you can interact with them using add-ons like Measure, Outline, or Accessibility to compare spacing of the or sizing of the production UI to what's in the design. And also designers can check how a component works before they use it in a new design that they might be working on. So, and when it comes to handoff, it also sort of streamlines that process a little bit. So anytime you connect a story to a component in Figma, what you'll notice is in the sidebar, Figma actually shows you a list of stories that that component is connected to. So during handoff, if a designer or if a developer is viewing the design spec, they can click on that open story in a browser and instantly jump into the Storybook environment with all of the add-ons, tests, and API docs to see what that component is and how to use that within their code. So to get you started with Storybook Connect, we have put together a little guide. It's a tutorial that walks through the entire process in Figma itself. Check it out. You'll learn about how to install the plugin in Figma and then link components within Figma or variants within Figma to stories that are in your Storybook. So with 6.5, these were sort of the main features that are going to be coming out. We're expecting to launch 6.5 in the next couple of weeks, and it also includes a few other improvements such as opt-in for MDX2, React 18's new root API, and CSF3 auto title improvements, plus hundreds of other sort of little improvements and bug fixes that have gone in over time. Looking ahead beyond 6.5 towards 7.0, we've started work on that too. So a couple of projects that have already kicked off is pre-bundling the manager UI for Storybook. So right now, even when you're using Vite with Storybook, the stories themselves are bundled using Vite, but the manager UI that Storybook uses still relies on Webpack. So we are going to be pre-bundling that manager UI so that you don't have to rely on Webpack at all when using the Vite builder. Plus Docs 2.0, with the goal there is to improve the API and make it easier to embed your stories into a custom docs side. And sort of related to that, there is a really exciting project called Storybook Canvas, where the goal is to make stories way more portable. So right now, the stories file is portable, but if you try to use that story file in another tool, that other tool doesn't really know how to render those stories in the browser for you. So with the Canvas project, we're going to provide everything that you need to render a CSF file as stories in a browser. So really excited about that project and excited to see sort of what that looks like in the end. And then also you can expect tons of UI improvements and the ability to tag stories in 7.0. So that is everything that I wanted to cover today. I'll pause here for questions and bring Jan and Dom back onto the screen to answer any questions you all might have. Just drop your questions in the YouTube live chat.
Hey everyone. I hope
Hey,
you
everyone.
enjoyed the event so far.
So I see one question here, if CSF3 is out of beta yet. Jan, do you want to give an update on that?
Sure. Well, CSF3 is actually enabled by default, the support in Storybook 6.4, and will be also enabled in 6.5. So you can essentially use it without having to set any feature flag. As in out of beta, I'm not entirely sure what that means exactly. There are so many different ways to use stories in many different contexts. There's a lot of people using stories within stories, like reusing some story arcs and such like that. There are a few tools that we're building to kind of like compose all of these things together, but we're still experimenting on top of that. So I would say that generally you can use CSF3 without any worries because it's going to stay and it's working really well. But if you're going to use CSF3 plus some complex scenarios of like reusing stories within stories or something like that, then you might need to wait a couple of moments because we're still going to work on that.
There's another question here around the alpha or beta for Storybook Canvas. That is coming later this year, closer to fall. It's part of the 7.0 update, so not quite there yet.
Yeah, but maybe one point to add, as soon as we release Storybook 6.5, That's going to become the latest version. However, as soon as we start working on the next version, you can already try that out. So if you really want to get into like testing the latest and greatest, you can always opt into the pre-releases. So just keep a look in the blog post and give it a try.
And also for the pre-releases, you can join us on Discord and the pre-release channel, where you can chat with other folks that are on the pre-release, as well as the maintainers that are building out the pre-release stuff.
Indeed. I also wanted to point that Sho Tanaka asked a question early on. So he was asking whether if you combine Storybook and mock service worker to mock your requests in your stories, if the play function is called after getting the mock service worker response. So it's a bit of a complex question, but basically mock service worker is a tool that allows you to fetch to basically mock any requests that happen from your component. And the Storybook play function executes after the component renders. So essentially, if you're using the mock service worker to mock your stuff, which happens at the decorator level, so the component will render, the data will be fetched, and that will be mocked, and then the play function will execute. So the answer, in short, is yes, but it really depends on what exactly are you looking for. But just to mention, I've been using mock service worker in my stories with the play function for auto interactions and some testings, and it's been working perfectly.
Thanks, Jan. There's another question around improving support for add-ons in a composed storybook. I believe that is something that's on the radar. It also sort of connects with when you're embedding stories into another tool. So yeah, I don't have specifics on it, but in general, yeah, we're looking to improve support there, so you can use the full set of add-ons when you're composing storybooks. Right. Another question on Figma. So are there any plans to generate code from exported Figma designs? Dom, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I helped work on the Figma plugin myself. At this point, no, mostly because we're working on pretty much like the workflows between and around Figma, not so much from the code generation standpoint. Code generation can be actually pretty tricky. If you've ever used a code generation tool as a developer, you probably encountered a situation where the generated code wasn't quite right. Even if it was close to right, it wasn't quite right for any reason, and it kind of makes you not trust the generation. So that's not something that we're working on now, but rather what we're working on is more ways to reference Figma inside of Storybook and or Chromatic, more ways to involve designers in the Storybook workflow via the Designs add-on or via via the plugin, via Chromatic. So that's currently what we're focused on.
Mason has a question on Canvas. So will Canvas support different Webpack configs? For example, one for Vue, one for React. I feel like it might be a little bit early right now to give an answer on that. But Jan, I'm not sure if you have some thoughts on that one.
I would say reach out to Michael Schumann on Twitter. He's the main person working on that feature, and he will definitely have a better answer for that.
Or the Discord. Honestly, that's a really
definitely
keep up to date with that kind of stuff. Could you speak to the level of effort for migrating from 6.4 to 6.5? Are there any breaking changes? I believe there are no breaking changes. Generally, our goal has been to make things opt-in, so it should not be any issues. But also, Jan's worked on the new auto migrate tool to make that process a little bit easier.
Yeah, maybe I should add some points. First of all, thanks a lot for asking. Ken, I'm going to drop a link to the migration guide, because whenever we make changes to Storybook, we do mention how to migrate. It really depends on exactly what you're looking for, because Storybook has been used with so many combinations of like builders, like let's say Webpack and Vite, but also frameworks like Preact, React, Vue, Svelte, and so many others. So it really depends on what you're looking for, but generally we're really trying to make the transition as smooth as possible. And also in light of that, we also are working on auto migration tools, so that if you just run SB upgrade to upgrade your storybook, it will also automatically try to detect whether you have some older format or files or something like that, and it will suggest to do those things automatically. So expect all the migration to be way smoother from now on in Storybook.
Aaron had a question if there's a post about using MSW in Storybook yet. Yes, there is. I will drop it in the chat right now. And I believe there's a new course coming out that Jan worked on that covers MSW quite a bit too.
Yeah, Jan,
Yeah,
can you speak
definitely.
to that course?
Yeah, sure. I've been working on a course basically for Storybook for React applications, which shows you from the very basics, as in like just setting up Storybook in the project, to building something more complex. Because a lot of people have been thinking that Storybook is a tool only for component libraries. So mostly application developers didn't even think of using Storybook. However, Storybook is so powerful and brings you so many things. As you can see here, we just mentioned like Figma integration, mocking requests, and many other things. So essentially, the main reason for my course is to enlighten people and show people what you can do with Storybook. So it's essentially showing how to integrate, how to retrofit components into your Storybook, from something very basic like a badge component, going up to like a restaurant cart, which is actually the ones you see in the Figma slides, up to the entire page that contains those components. And then when you get into the page, because it's something more complex, then you need to like mock fetch requests, right? So it's a combination of all the interesting things that you can do in Storybook, such as adding support for Redux for state management, adding support for like style components and switching themes directly in Storybook, connecting Figma designs, mocking fetch requests, connecting to Chromatic for visual regression, installing the test runner so you can get automated tests for your stories, doing accessibility tests, and so on and so forth. So it will be announced very likely at the start of next week. So I'm just going to drop my Twitter, and if you want to get some updates, just keep posted.
Thanks,
I've seen a
Jan.
preview of the course. Highly recommend it. It's very detailed.
Fantastic course. And to underline a little bit about what Jan said, the kind of a guiding light for us is when you write stories, like you should get a bunch of stuff for free, whether that's like static analysis, whether that's active like testing, whether that's regression testing, or integrations with the ecosystem of JavaScript and design tools. So as a developer who uses Storybook, our goal is to make your time as like valuable as possible. And so anytime you spend building a story and writing stories for your components and pages, you get there's a multiplicative effort in an automation from an automation perspective.
Right. Think sorry. There's a question around the possibility of styling Storybook, so switching out icons or folder structures, or custom layouts, and things like that. So I'll break that out into two parts. One is sort of the folder structure and how you organize Storybook. I recently wrote a post about it. I'll drop a link shortly that shows you sort of how to approach that and different strategies that teams take there. As far as sort of customizing the Storybook UI, for the time being, that is supported through some of the Storybook theming stuff and a couple of add-ons like the dark mode add-on. However, with 7.0, and Dominic could probably speak a little bit more about this, we're hoping to make more updates to the UI where theming might become a little bit easier in the future.
Yeah, that's right. So 7.0 will have a bit more substantial updates to the user experience of Storybook, and making it more efficient for you to use the app. Earlier, the app itself, the app layer. Earlier in this talk, Jan and Varun went over the stuff we're doing behind the scenes, like below the surface of the app layer. 7.0 is on the surface of that app layer.
There's a question around that says, I recall there were some discussions around having Storybook's core move from Webpack to Vite. Will this happen someday? So the changes that we made with the Builder API, that kind of abstracted that out to a large degree. So you can actually, when you switch builders, that's kind of what's happening. It's switching out what builder is powering Storybook. The last remaining piece right now is the manager UI is built by Webpack itself. But once that pre-bundling aspect is complete, then you won't have to rely on Webpack at all. So if you switch to Vite, you get everything that is just powered by Vite. So yeah, it's kind of already happened. And in the future, it'll just be sort of more complete support, I would say. Cool. I think we got through all of the questions. I'll wait a couple more minutes if anyone has questions.
And as far as getting a shirt like Jan, join us in Discord and mention Johnny Bigodes, who's a team member, to get a swag box shipped to you. Limited time only, though, for the people here.
Well, we do have a question from Jimmy Collin. So he's asking, is there a recommended way to get existing UI tests using React testing library and mock service worker into Storybook tests? So that's a very interesting question, because the idea that we brought tests from, like, let's say your Jest test into Storybook was to make it simpler, so that essentially the code itself is pretty much the same. We're just using testing library. So instead of just like getting the global stuff from testing library, you would get from the Storybook testing library wrapper that we have. And as far as mock service worker goes, that really depends on how you do the setup. But essentially, mock service worker works by having a list of handlers. So if you set up the mock service worker Storybook add-on, you just pass those handlers, so that would just work seamlessly.
And Natalia has a question: if there's any plan to implement multiple frameworks in one Storybook bundle support. So I don't think there are any plans for that right now, but the way we support that is through composition. So you can have multiple storybooks and compose them into one, and each of these sort of composed storybooks can be powered by different frameworks. So that's our approach to that. All the frameworks tend to use quite a sort of divergent build setup, I would say. So it's hard to sort of package it all up into one storybook for the time being. Any other questions, folks?
Well, it's been asked about a Discord community link. So I just dropped a link at the chat. Feel free to join the community. It's a great community. It's got a lot of interesting people. So many nice people are actually right now in the chat. So thank you so much for coming to the event. And yeah, let's make the community grow.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you all for joining today. We'll, like I said, going to be releasing 6.5 in the next week or two, so watch out for that. And I will hopefully upload this video to YouTube. This is our first time doing it, so you'll have access to it if you want to share it with a teammate or other developers that you work with. So thank you all for joining again today.
And respond in the comments if you found this useful, and that'll help us understand whether to do it again for 7.0 and all the other releases in the future. Thank you so much.
See you all.
All the best, guys. Bye.